this in here again, but a slightly different angle. Things are getting critical for all of us, and I want to talk about the end game in the establishment of the digital control grid, which really is a battle for control over mankind. Roughly 90% of central banks are currently preparing to launch central bank digital currencies. So we have to get ready for something that, unfortunately, is designed to change the world. What's new about it? Well, you always have to distinguish between the narrative and the reality. It's one of the first things I learned when I came to Japan, is they sort of formalize this. There's the tatemae, the facade, the outer appearance, that's the official story, the narrative. And they will tell you, there's always two truths. You know, there's the tatemae and there's the real truth. So the narrative is, that's called hone, by the way, for the Japanese speakers. The narrative is, oh, we need to introduce CBDC, says Madame Lagarde, because we have to respond to things like Bitcoin and then digital money. We have to offer digital currency. And that's been emphasized in all the PR material. And of course, you'll be smiling when you read this. Here she goes off again, because is that the new aspect? Digital money? We haven't had digital money? Well, we all know a lot of digital money. But it's not just Bitcoin and alt currencies. Most payments have been digital for decades. Whether it is actually trying to get cash, you will go to your bank, or whether you're paying with direct debit cards, with the PIN code, the contactless, the credit card, Apple Pay, Google Pay, you know, Alipay, WePay in China, of course, has been around for much longer, dominating payments. Prepaid cards or others, they're all digital. So we have been using digital payments, and you know, they're linking back to bank accounts, and our bank accounts have been digital for decades, since the introduction of some form of IT systems going back to the 70s. That's not the new aspect. In fact, you can say we've been using BDC for decades. Of course, they're not saying that because they want to slightly mislead you, as they always want to. So what's the difference? What is new about this? The BDC aspect is old. It's the C bit, the central bit. So it is a question of central planners wanting more power. Yet again, is this justified? And of course, they are adamant, we will not abuse the limitless powers that CBDCs will give us. Okay, I'm paraphrasing. This is the translation of their claims. Now, McKinsey's study on CBDCs actually said that, well, why haven't they been rolled out faster? And the fact is, and I've mentioned this in recent talks, I mean, I've been warning of CBDCs since 2015-16 very explicitly in my publications and interviews, because, and the reason was that because I was made aware that they were ready to be rolled out at that time in the ultimate form, because using your phone is not the ultimate form we're talking about, that's just an intermediary step. I mean, you have to look at what Elon Musk is doing with brain implants and other technologies, and what they're doing in Sweden with microchip implants for payments, opening doors, your passport or ID card, all in one little grain of rice scale microchip implant under your skin in your hand. That's the sort of technology we're talking about. Anyway, so the question, the real puzzle has been, why haven't they been rolled out faster? They've been ready, they've been waiting in the wings to roll them out. And McKinsey gives three reasons. One is that a clear or substantiated value proposition has yet to be documented. This is McKinsey talk. A value proposition has to. In other words, There's no good reason for CBDCs. We don't need them. What are the benefits? They seem to be limited. Okay, that's point number one. And of course, as Neil Kashkari, head of the Minnesota Federal Reserve Bank, has said, and you can find the YouTube video, CBDCs are a solution to a problem we don't have. We don't need them. So the second point is, trust, says McKinsey, remains a hurdle. Citizens are not really trusting this idea. They question, can you believe it, the motives behind CBDCs, often suspecting governments of aiming to monitor and restrict financial activities. Who would have thought that? And thirdly, technical challenges, and they go into details why actually there have been delays. Now, as some would put it, have you got a seatbelt? Buckle up. We're talking about the biggest upheaval in our monetary system in 330 years. Because what is clearly happening is a change in the structure and also the power structure and the control structure of our monetary system. Just a few recent updates, just 3 days ago, turns out the CBDC pilot scheme in Brazil, where they had revealed the source code, and that was analyzed by, in fact, this was Pedro Magalhães, a blockchain developer, who says that, well, he found the code that shows that they're going to use this to limit control transactions and also freeze transactions and take your money. Not entirely surprised, are we? Because how did Justin Trudeau end the trucker demonstration in Ottawa in Canada? They were demonstrating for freedom and against restrictions of individual human rights. It was a peaceful demonstration, but it clearly annoyed the government. It was going on for a long time. Well, their bank accounts were frozen and they couldn't buy food and drink anymore. Too few had cash with them. That was the problem, really. So control over their digital money was how these demonstrations ended. At the time, they needed new legislation, how to do that. That was ran through, as many laws got ran through around those years, 2020, 21. And if you look at the details, this is from a police report. 206 financial products were frozen, including bank and corporate accounts. 56 entities were forced to disclose information associated with vehicles, individuals, companies, facial recognition. The whole digital control grid was utilized, and 253 Bitcoin addresses with virtual currency exchanges were also seized. And of course, they stopped also the PayPal payments coming through from the rest of the world supporting the truckers. Notice that no such financial controls had until then been introduced to stop other criminals and other crimes. Think about that. And of course, since 2020, the idea of digital IDs in the form of vaccination passports, health passports, essentially have been introduced. And of course, a digital currency allows the rollout of a Chinese-style social credit scoring system, which means that if you are critical, say, of a particular government, this is likely to have direct consequences. That's the whole point of a social credit score system. So, the digital aspect is new. It's the central aspect that's new with CBDCs. And what we see is, and that is why I can claim this is the biggest upheaval in 330 years of monetary history. Central banks are literally stepping out of the shadows from behind the curtains. They are ripping up the 330-year-old concordat that had been in place between banks and central banks, where the rules were the banks deal with people, the central banks deal with banks. So it was a two-tier system. Now the central banks are saying it's not enough for us to have only 3% of the money creation in our hands. We want direct control of the whole system. Essentially, CBDCs are ultimately, and certainly retail CBDCs, a current account at the central bank for everyone, which means the central banks as bank regulators are stepping into the arena to compete with the regulated. If in a football game, soccer game, the referee decides, oh, I'm getting a bit bored here watching these people scoring, it'd be fun to score some goals myself, and joins the game, but continues to utilize liberally red cards, yellow cards, the whistle. Who's going to win that game? It's going to be the referee. So, what are the central banks doing here? What are their motives? And we haven't checked this. Do you think it's going to work if I press this link? It's only 56 seconds. Or if everyone has seen this, I mean, this is really a must. And this, by the way, is the biggest promoter of Bitcoin and alternative cryptocurrencies. His name is Augustine Carstens. He's the managing director of the Bank for International Settlements. I always love the fat cats to come forward and have their word. He's letting the cat out of the bag. Who hasn't heard it? Who hasn't seen it? Do you want to see it? 56 seconds of your life? Okay.
You can just put your mic on the laptop, right?
Let's see. I think it's going to work.
Our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of the general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash, and there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability, and also we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
Präsentation von aktueller Folie. Bildschirm,
So, that's the key point. He gave away the game. Now, again, not long ago, this is just from last month, the BIS came out and said that its vision for a digital system, a unified ledger at the heart of the monetary system, should actually include, they claim, not just CBDCs and bank digital currency, but other assets, because we're being encouraged to tokenize other assets. And maybe there could be compulsory tokenization of assets. And of course, why is that so attractive to central planners? Because then you have digital control over all assets, all the assets of the people. And of course, you can enforce the programmability that this tool allows, and which is what they're most excited about. And that includes, of course, freezing assets, reassigning them to somebody else or to different use. The Bank of England has come forward quite officially and formally asked the government to essentially authorize the programmability of the British version of CBDCs that they're working on. And there's other things that are already out. December 22, the BCBS, the bankers, the Basel Committee on Bank Supervision, again in Basel and at the BIS, has already imposed particular climate-related rules that are imposed on banks, and banks will need to enforce this vis-a-vis their customers. So you see some of the toolkit at the moment still rolled out via the banking system, but of course that will clearly, since it comes from the central banks, also be applied to CBDCs. The Financial Stability Board has talked about the climate-related risks and the need to have a system that will restrict transactions that are of too high climate risks. And of course the ECB announced also November 22 that banks need to meet certain rules considering environmental risks, and essentially it's a way of punishing banks that don't follow that climate credit scoring system. And the tools are out on other fronts as well. MasterCard unveiled this carbon calculator tool for banks so that everyone's transaction can be assessed and given a score in terms of their CO2 impact or other environmental parameters. And of course, these are the tools that can then be applied, and using AI, it can be automated, because your question may be, okay, can they really control so many people in all these transactions? Well, that's where tools like AI come in. They like to be used not by us to control and make more transparent what the decision makers, the politicians are doing, and what the central planners are doing, but these are tools to be used by central planners against us. Now, what are the official benefits of CBDCs that are telling us, oh, it's a way of having safe government-backed alternatives to commercial bank deposits? And that discloses the agenda to kill banks. And of course, there is this speech given in May by Christine Lagarde, that additional currency issued in Europe by the ECB will be another form in which Europe can successfully compete against the United States. That was her argument. Now that's usual central planners gaslighting, because and it's very disingenuous, because the entire EU is an American project. I mean, that's been known for over 20 years, because CIA records have been declassified, whether by mistake or not, but it's now a matter of public record that Jean Monnet, Schumann, Spaak, Adenauer were CIA agents, and they're working on the explicit plan to create the United States of Europe. The CIA funded the European movement, the European youth movement. All the European parties were, since the 1960s, given cash by the CIA if they put into their party programs the plan to unify Europe. And that's why suddenly everyone was saying this. And they all thought, well, that's in a few decades, yeah, we'll put it in, we get the cash. And that's how it started. And of course, it also explains why this European system, political structure that was created, is entirely undemocratic. I mean, how can all these democratic countries come up with a system that's undemocratic? Well, it was imposed top-down by the CIA. And, you know, when Kissinger says, when I call Europe, who do I call? He didn't mean to have a chat, okay, and he didn't want to call 28 countries. So that's how it works. He calls the European Commission, which is the Politburo, the unelected Eurocrats, that write the laws. The Soviet Union had a parliament, but it was a rubber stamp parliament because the Politburo was the only one to have the power to table any laws. That's the structure we have in Europe. The European Parliament is a rubber stamp parliament. It cannot propose any laws. They all come from the unelected Politburo, and that's controlled by the CIA, which is a matter of public record. Read these articles, you know, OSS, CIA, and European Unity, the American Committee on United Europe, Richard Aldrich, and so on. There's others. So that argument is also disingenuous. I mean, you can go through all these arguments and you find that it doesn't make sense. So I want to add to the list of reasons why we should not allow the introduction of CBDCs, why we should really fight fiercely for this. I'd like to quickly show you a presentation I gave 21 years ago, and I called it the spectre of central bank risk. And I defined the central bank risk as the risk that, as in previous decades, central banks have become increasingly powerful, independent, unaccountable. They're using this power, actually abusing this power, in order to create changes that they want, and that they would intentionally create boom-bust cycles, banking crises, inflation, deflation, in order to achieve their goals. And it's important to see that, you know, this was presented decades ago, because otherwise, well, it's easy to say now that we've had the 2008 crisis, and they became more powerful, and then we had the inflation, and it became more powerful. Easy to say now. Well, that's exactly what I've been warning, as you also know from my books, Princes of the Yen, A New Paradigm in Macroeconomics, which were before the 2008 crisis, when I warned of the recurring banking crisis, and that the central planners will again ask for more powers, which is why we have this problem of regulatory moral hazard. We're rewarding them for all the crises they've done, and therefore the next crisis is already pre-programmed, because they know they're going to get more powerful. But now they're moving to the end game. So in this presentation, I lay out the argument. At the time, people thought the business cycle is dead, and they were saying, well, it's not dead. Actually, cycles have increased in frequency and amplitude since central banks have become more independent and more powerful, because they are the manipulators of the macroeconomies. And there is that correlation. The more power they've received, the more we've had big cycles, boom-bust cycles, and crises. Now, what do the central banks say about this accusation, if you want? Oh, we have nothing to do with these crises. No, our job is to deliver stability. Read their speeches and have a word search. How often do they use the word stability, stable this, stable that, stable growth, stable prices, stable currencies? Okay. Stable climate. So, are they delivering? Well, a bit of fact checking is needed. In fact, they have a whole string of claims. So first they say, our goal is to deliver prices. We have to, stability in prices, stability in currency, stability in growth. We need to see whether they deliver. Then they say, to do that, to achieve the stability, we're using interest rates as their tool. And thirdly, they say, why interest rates? Because that's the most important macro variable. And I checked these three claims. We start with interest rates. They claim that lower rates lead to higher growth rates lead to lower growth. As you know, just this morning, breakfast, I overheard some people saying, they're raising interest rates, we need to slow the economy. That's what we've been hearing for decades. What's the empirical evidence for this? If you look at the scatter plot between interest rates and growth, you'll see that is positively correlated. And if you check the timing, growth comes first, interest rates follow. Now that's very strange, because for the past 200 years, all schools of economic thought famously disagree on many things, 2 economists, 3 opinions, but they all agree on one thing. Whether classical, neoclassical, Keynesian monetarists, neoclassical, neo-Vixelian, post-Keynesian, Austrian even, ecological economists, they all agree. Lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth, which really is the law and the profits of equilibrium economics. You'd assume there'd be hundreds of studies, certainly over these 200 years, that have established this. That's why we all know this to be true. So how many empirical studies actually exist that demonstrate this proclaimed correlation and causation? There aren't any. There aren't any. So it turned out that, together with a colleague, I was the first to actually do some empirical tests on this. You can look it up. It's open source. Just Google reconsidering monetary policy, perhaps with my name. That's US, Japan, Germany, UK over half a century. We also did 19 countries, higher frequency, monthly data. Conclusion is interest rates and growth are positively correlated, long rates, short rates. I mean, in fact, the result is so astonishingly strong. There were only 7 quarters of exceptions in Japan for the long rates. For short rates, 0 exceptions. This is using proper cutting-edge econometrics, DCC gauge model, dynamic conditional correlation gauge. And the correlation, therefore, is very clear as positive, but statistical causation runs also from growth to interest rates. That means the whole interest rate story is fake news. It's just not true. So high rates lead to low growth, what they tell us, but the reality is high growth leads to high rates. Low growth leads to low rates. And we've learned to live with this cognitive dissonance. Well, that raises a number of questions. I don't have time to go into all of them, but clearly it shows there's something seriously wrong with their narrative. So they claim they're using interest rates as their main monetary policy tool. Well, actually, in the past decades, they have essentially conceded that rates don't really work so well. Since I proposed, based on my analysis, which is based on empirical economics, that quantities are more important, and particularly the quantity of credit is important. So I proposed a new monetary policy in Japan in 1995 called quantitative easing. That's the original article in the Nikkei, Nihon Keizai Shimbun. Keiki kaifuku ryōteki kinyu kanwa kara. Right? You can have a recovery through quantitative easing, quantitative monetary easing. So central banks essentially conceded after the 2008 crisis that, okay, we'll do the quantitative stuff because there is an issue with interest rates. Well, it's not just with the 2008 crisis, it's a constant issue. What about their claim that they aim at price stability, economic and currency stability? Well, there isn't any evidence for this whatsoever. And of course, the causation, the chain of causation is credit creation drives economic growth. Economic growth drives profits. Profits drive the stock market. Nominal growth also drives bond yields. And relative credit creation drives currency. So it's always the quantity of credit, not, as they say, interest rates. And through their control of the quantity of credit, they have been manipulating all these markets and creating these boom-bust cycles and crises and currency moves. And the deeds of the central banks, as I pointed out in 2002, already were these massive boom-bust cycles. Japan, acid inflation, then a massive Great Depression, the Fed asset boom in the 90s, and I warned in the book Prince of the Yen that there will be a global financial crisis if the Fed goes on like this, which is what we had, ECB, and that. So,